Sometimes the most broken hearts recognize each other across a crowded room. At a dusty county auction in Texas, 54-year-old Jace Duvall watched as an aging donkey named Elmer was led onto the platform, unwanted and mocked by the crowd. Once a rodeo champion, Jace now lived out of his pickup truck, taking whatever work he found. But something about those tired, proud eyes struck him deep. This stubborn old donkey was just like him, cast aside, forgotten, but still standing. With $23 in his pocket, Jace did something that would change both their lives forever. He raised his hand and shouted 3 simple words that started it all. Could saving an unwanted donkey actually save a broken man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The first thing Jace Duvall heard every morning was the creak of his pickup truck suspension settling as he shifted his weight on the bench, seat that had served as his bed for the past 8 months. This morning was no different. The Texas sun filtered through the cracked windshield, casting familiar shadows across the dashboard where an empty coffee cup sat next to a dog-eared paperback and a handful of crumpled receipts from fence repair jobs. He stretched his legs as much as the cab would allow, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, a souvenir from too many years riding bulls and broncs, and too many nights sleeping in places never meant for rest. At 54, Jace's body carried the map of his former life, the slight limp from a bull named Thundercloud in Amarillo, the crooked set to his left shoulder from a bronc in San Antonio, and hands that bore the permanent calluses of a man who'd spent his life holding tight to things that wanted to throw him off. He reached across to the glove compartment, his fingers finding the familiar weight of the object he hadn't looked at in months but touched almost daily. The tarnished silver belt buckle was the size of his palm, heavy and substantial, with his name engraved across the bottom, Jace Duvall, all-around champion, Houston Rodeo, 1995. Once, that buckle had caught arena lights and camera flashes. Once it had meant something. Now it sat hidden in the dark, like everything else from his glory days. Jace had been 25 that year in Houston, riding high on a streak that seemed unstoppable. He'd won the all-around title 3 years running, and the prize money had felt endless. There'd been a house then, a real one with a mortgage and a front porch where his son Marcus had learned to walk. There'd been endorsement deals and magazine covers, and people who knew his name in every rodeo town from Montana to Mexico. But rodeo fame burned bright and brief, like struck matches in a windstorm. The injuries accumulated faster than the wins. The younger riders came up hungry, while Jace got cautious. The prize money started going to pay for surgery instead of savings. And somewhere in those final failing years of competition, he'd lost more than his edge. He'd lost his family. Marcus had been 12 when Jace finally hung up his spurs for good. By then, the boy had already learned not to expect his father at school events or birthday parties. Rodeo schedule came first, always. Even after retirement, Jace had chased the ghost of his former success, taking trainer jobs that never lasted, investment opportunities that evaporated like morning dew, and get-rich-quick schemes that only made him poorer. The divorce had been final by the time Marcus turned 16. By 20, the boy had stopped calling entirely. Now Marcus was 29, and Jace had missed everything. Graduation, first job, the engagement he'd only heard about through mutual friends. Somewhere along the way, Jace had become a stranger to his own son, a name that came up awkwardly at family gatherings Marcus attended without him. The truck rocked slightly as a semi passed on the highway just beyond the truck stop where Jace had parked for the night. He'd chosen this spot because it was free, because the bathroom was clean enough, and because the diner stayed open late enough for him to nurse a cup of coffee and use their Wi-Fi to search for work. Tonight would be his last night here. Tomorrow, he'd drive to the county auction in Millfield, where Tommy Breslin had promised there'd be a week's worth of fence work afterward. Jace folded back the old army blanket that served as his bedding and pulled on his boots. They were good boots still, custom-made, back when he could afford such things, though the leather was worn soft and the heels were down to their last risoling. He'd bought them in 1997 after a particularly good season, telling himself they were an investment in his future. He'd never imagined that future would include sleeping in truck cabs and counting quarters for coffee. The morning routine was efficient, born of necessity and repetition. Wash up in the truck stop bathroom, shave with the travel kit that fit in his jacket pocket, brush his teeth and comb his grey-streaked hair back under his hat. Check the truck's oil and tire pressure. He couldn't afford a breakdown. Not with $23 to his name and payday still a day away. In the diner, he ordered coffee and oatmeal, the cheapest breakfast on the menu. The waitress was kind, a woman about his age with tired eyes who didn't ask questions about why a man was eating breakfast at 7 in the morning, looking like he'd just woken up in a parking lot. She kept his coffee cup full without being asked, and when she handed him the check, she'd knocked $1 off without mentioning it. "You heading to the auction today?" she asked, noticing the direction his truck was pointed. "That's the plan," Jace said, leaving a tip that was probably too generous for his situation, but felt right anyway. "Good luck," she said, and something in her voice suggested she understood about luck, and how precious little of it some folks seem to get. The drive to Millfield took 2 hours through countryside that looked like every other stretch of Texas. Rolling hills covered in brown grass, barbed wire fences marking property lines, and cattle clustered around stock tanks in whatever shade they could find. Jace knew this landscape like scripture, had traveled these roads and countless others just like them for 30 years. There was comfort in the familiarity, even if the circumstances had changed. The auction yard came into view just after 9 in the morning, already busy with trucks and trailers. Jace had been to dozens of these events over the years, sometimes as a buyer when money was good, sometimes just as entertainment when it wasn't. Country auctions were social events as much as business, places where ranchers and farmers gathered to see neighbors, trade gossip, and maybe pick up a bargain. He parked at the edge of the lot and walked toward the sale barn, his boots kicking up dust that coated everything with a fine layer of grit. The smell was familiar too, hay and manure, diesel exhaust and coffee from the concession stand. The particular scent of livestock that had spent the night in unfamiliar pens. Inside the barn, folding chairs were arranged in rough semicircles around the sale ring. Early arrivals had claimed the best seats, spreading sale bills and thermoses on adjacent chairs to save spots for friends. Jace found an empty spot in the back, close enough to see, but far enough away to avoid conversations about the old days that might arise if someone recognized him. The auctioneer was testing his microphone, running through practice rounds of the rapid-fire chant that would move animals and equipment through the ring all day. "Would you give me 25, now 30, now 30? Would you give me 30? The rhythm was hypnotic, a language Jace understood even when the words blurred together. He studied the sale bill, a photocopied sheet listing the day's offerings. Cattle made up most of the lots, bred cows, stocker calves, a few bulls past their prime. There was farm equipment too, and household goods from estate sales. Near the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, was Lot 247, one grey donkey, approximately 12 years old, gentle broke. Jace had no business even thinking about buying anything, especially livestock. He had nowhere to keep an animal, no way to feed it properly, and no logical reason to take on that kind of responsibility. But something about the sparse description caught his attention. Gentle broke usually meant an animal that had been worked with, trained for riding or driving. Donkeys weren't common at cattle auctions. They were usually kept as guard animals or pets, passed along through family or sold quietly between neighbors. The morning stretched on with the predictable rhythm of rural commerce. Cattle sold well. The drought had been good to beef prices, even if it had been hard on everything else. Equipment moved slowly, with farmers being cautious about spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Jace found himself checking his watch, calculating how long it would be before they reached Lot 247. He tried to tell himself he was just curious, that he had no intention of bidding on anything. But his fingers kept finding the thin roll of bills in his shirt pocket. $23, enough for gas and one more cheap meal, but certainly not enough to buy livestock. Still, he stayed in his seat as the lots moved past, watching the auctioneer work his craft and the buyers signal their bids with subtle nods and raised hands. The sun climbed higher outside, and the barn grew warm, despite the fans running overhead. Some of the older men dozed in their chairs, waking only when lots they were interested in came up. Children ran between the seats and women visited quietly while keeping one eye on the action in the ring. It was the kind of scene Jace had loved once, back when he belonged to this world in a different way. When he'd had money to spend and a reputation that earned him respectful nods from other buyers. When he'd driven to auctions in a clean truck with a horse trailer behind it, looking for bloodstock or equipment for the small ranch he'd thought would be his future. But that was another life, owned by a different man. The Jace Duvall, sitting in the back row of a sale barn in Millfield, Texas, was nobody special, just another down-on-his-luck cowboy hoping to find work and a place to sleep that wasn't the front seat of a pickup truck. The morning wore on, and Lot 247 crept closer. When Lot 247 finally came up, Jace almost missed it. He'd been watching a group of young cowboys near the front, their crisp shirts and confident postures reminding him of himself at that age, when the auctioneer's voice cut through his memories. Next up, folks, we've got a little something different. Lot 247, one greyjack about 12 years old. Now I know what you're thinking. What am I going to do with a donkey? Well, let me tell you, these animals make fine guard stock. Keep the coyotes away from your calves. And this old boy's gentle broke to lead and drive. The barn door swung open, and a teenage boy led in the most tired-looking animal Jace had ever seen. The donkey, Elmer, according to the paperwork, was indeed grey, though patches of his coat had faded to an almost white, and other sections showed the darker shading that spoke of age and hard use. His ears, magnificent and alert, despite everything else about him, swiveled constantly as he took in the crowd and the unfamiliar surroundings. But it was the lead rope that caught Jace's attention first. Frayed and dirty, it had been repaired multiple times with different types of rope spliced together. The braided sections were stained with years of sweat and weather, and the snap clip was bent from use. Someone had cared enough to keep repairing it rather than buying new, which suggested either poverty or sentiment, possibly both. Now, he's got good feet, stands quiet for the farrier, and he's been used for packing and light driving. The consignor tells me he's been a family pet for years, but circumstances change, and they can't keep him anymore. Circumstances change. Jace knew about that. He studied the donkey more carefully, noting the way Elmer stood with dignity, despite his obvious nervousness. His head was up, ears forward, alert but not panicked. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, and something else, a wariness that suggested this animal had learned not to trust too quickly or completely. The teenage handler, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, tried to encourage Elmer to walk around the ring to show off his movement. But the donkey had planted his feet and wasn't budging. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "Come on now, get him moving," the auctioneer encouraged. "Show these folks how he travels." The boy tugged on the lead rope, but Elmer remained statue still. More laughter from the audience, and Jace could hear whispered comments. "Stubborn as a mule," and "that's why they call 'em jackasses." "Well," the auctioneer said with practiced good humor, "I reckon he's showing you exactly how much he wants to be here. Let's start the bidding at $50. Who'll give me 50 for this fine jack?" Silence filled the barn. Jace looked around at the faces of the other buyers, ranchers and farmers who were practical men with practical needs. A donkey, especially an older one with an obvious stubborn streak, didn't fit into many business plans. How about 25? Surely somebody needs a guard animal. These donkeys will fight a coyote or wild dog, and they're easy keepers. $25? Who'll start me at 25? Still nothing. The auctioneer tried again, dropping his price, $15 then. "Come on, folks. You can't buy a good dog for $15, and this animal will work for his keep." 15 to get us started? A hand went up near the front, a woman in a straw hat who operated a petting zoo an hour south of town. Jace had seen her at other auctions, picking up gentle horses and ponies for her operation. I've got 15, now 20, now 20. Would you give me 20? Jace found himself studying Elmer more intently. The donkey had stopped looking around the crowd and was now focused on something or someone. Those intelligent eyes seemed to be searching the faces in the bleachers, and when their gaze met Jace's, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that they were both strangers in this place, both being evaluated and found wanting. I've got 15 from the lady in the hat. Do I hear 20? How about 18? Surely this animal's worth $18 to someone. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jace could see the consignor, a middle-aged man in clean work clothes, shifting nervously near the sale ring. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. The man kept glancing at Elmer with something that might have been regret, or maybe just embarrassment, that his animal was generating so little interest. 15 once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. That's when Jace saw it, the exact moment when Elmer seemed to give up. The donkey's ears drooped slightly, and his head lowered just a fraction. It was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around animals. This was resignation, the look of a creature who'd been disappointed before and was steeling himself for whatever came next. Jace knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror too many times lately. $23. The words left his mouth before his brain could stop them. Every head in the sale barn turned to look at him, including the auctioneer, who seemed as surprised as anyone. Well, all right then. I've got 23 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 25? 25 from anyone? The woman in the straw hat was looking at Jace with curiosity, but didn't raise her bid. She'd been in this business long enough to know when to cut her losses, and a bidding war over an aging donkey wasn't good business sense. 23 once. 23 twice. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one more time. Sold for $23 to bidder number 47. Applause rippled through the barn, not for the sale, but for the fact that someone had saved the animal from what might have been an uncertain fate. Jace realized he was holding the paddle he'd been given when he registered. The number 47 that now connected him to this purchase he couldn't afford and couldn't explain. As he made his way down to the sale office to complete the transaction, he caught fragments of conversation. That old cowboy's got a soft heart, and $23 for a donkey. Hell, that's barely dog food money. He tried to ignore the comments and focus on the practical details ahead. The paperwork was simple. One bill of sale, transfer of ownership, and the exchange of his last $23 for a receipt and the frayed lead rope. The consignor approached him as he signed the forms. "I appreciate what you did," the man said quietly. "That donkey belonged to my daughter, but she's away at college now, and my wife's allergic to the hay. We just couldn't keep him anymore, and I was worried." He trailed off, but Jace understood. The man had been worried about what kind of home Elmer might end up in, or if he'd end up anywhere at all. "What's his name?" Jace asked. "Elmer. My daughter named him when she was 12. He's gentle as a lamb, just stubborn when he doesn't want to do something. She taught him to pull a cart, and he used to pack gear when we went camping. He's good with his feet, never had any health problems." Jace nodded, accepting the lead rope with its spliced sections and bent hardware. "I'll take good care of him." "I believe you will," the man said, and shook Jace's hand with obvious relief, walking back toward the sale ring to collect his purchase. Jace wondered what exactly he'd just committed himself to. He had no money for feed, no place to keep a donkey, and no plan beyond the vague hope that tomorrow's fence job would solve at least some of his problems. But when he approached Elmer, still standing exactly where the handler had left him, the donkey turned those intelligent eyes toward him with what might have been hope. "Well, old man," Jace said quietly, taking hold of the frayed rope, "I reckon we're in this together now." Elmer didn't resist when Jace led him toward the exit. If anything, he seemed relieved to be moving, to have a direction and a person who belonged to him. They walked through the barn together, past the continuing auction and the crowd of buyers who'd already forgotten about Lot 247. Outside, in the dusty parking lot, Jace faced his first practical problem, getting Elmer to his truck. The trailer he'd used for hauling horses was long gone, sold 2 years ago when the money ran out. All he had was the pickup, and while it had a long bed, loading a donkey into the back of a truck wasn't exactly standard practice. But Elmer, it turned out, was full of surprises. When Jace lowered the tailgate and patted the truck bed, the donkey examined the situation for a moment, then stepped up into the bed as naturally as boarding a trailer. He stood calmly, balanced and alert, while Jace secured the lead rope to the tie-down rings. "You've done this before," Jace said, impressed despite himself. As they drove away from the auction, Jace caught glimpses of Elmer in his rearview mirror, ears forward, watching the passing landscape with apparent interest. Neither of them knew where they were headed, but for the first time in months, Jace wasn't traveling alone. The frayed lead rope lay coiled on the seat beside him, its worn fibers a tangible reminder that some things were worth holding on to, even when they looked like they'd seen better days. Especially then. The first thing Jace realized as he pulled into the rest area 20 miles outside Millfield was that owning a donkey complicated everything. Finding a place to sleep for the night had been challenging enough when it was just him and his truck. Now he had to consider water, feed, and somewhere Elmer could move around safely. The rest area was nearly empty, just a family from Oklahoma in a minivan and a long-haul trucker catching a few hours of sleep. Jace parked as far from the other vehicles as possible and climbed out to assess his situation. Elmer stood patiently in the truck bed, but Jace could see the animal was tired from the ride and ready to get down. "Easy, old man," Jace said, lowering the tailgate. "Let's see about getting you some room to stretch your legs." Elmer backed down from the truck with the same calm competence he'd shown loading up, and Jace led him to a grassy area near the picnic tables. The donkey immediately lowered his head and began grazing, as if he understood this might be his only chance for decent food for a while. Jace checked his pockets and came up with the crumpled business card Tommy Breslin had given him 3 weeks ago. The card was bent and stained from carrying it in his shirt pocket, but the phone number was still legible. Tommy had promised a week's worth of fence work starting tomorrow, which would mean steady pay for the first time in a month. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Jace had a donkey, no money, and only the vaguest idea of what he was doing. He called Tommy from the payphone near the restrooms, feeding quarters into the slot while keeping one eye on Elmer. "Breslin, Tommy, it's Jace Duvall. I'm supposed to start that fence job for you tomorrow." Right. You still coming? I've got 3 miles of boundary fence that needs replacing, and I'm hoping to get it done before the weather turns. I'll be there. Question, though, I've got a donkey with me now. Any chance I could keep him on your place while I'm working? I'll pay for the feed." There was a pause. "A donkey? What the hell you doing with a donkey, Jace?" "Long story. He's gentle, won't cause any trouble. I just need somewhere to keep him." "Well," Tommy said slowly, "I suppose you could put him in the back pasture with the horses. They might appreciate the company. But you're responsible for any damage he causes." "Understood. I'll be there first thing in the morning." Jace hung up feeling slightly better about tomorrow, but tonight remained a problem. He couldn't leave Elmer tied to the truck all night, and he couldn't very well let him run loose. The donkey was watching him with those intelligent eyes, as if he understood the conversation and was waiting to see what solution Jace would come up with. The family from Oklahoma approached as they headed back to their van. The father, a man about Jace's age wearing a neat polo shirt and khakis, looked curious rather than concerned. "That's a fine-looking donkey," he said. "Don't see many of them traveling the highways. Just picked him up at an auction," Jace replied. Still figuring out the logistics, the man's wife joined them, followed by 2 children who were immediately fascinated by Elmer. The donkey seemed to enjoy the attention, allowing the kids to pet his neck while their parents watched nervously. "He's so soft," the little girl said. "What's his name?" "Elmer," Jace said, surprised by how natural it felt to claim ownership of the animal. "We're headed to Dallas to see my sister," the woman said. The kids have been cooped up in the car all day. This is the most excited they've been about anything since we left Tulsa. Jace watched as Elmer nuzzled the boy's hand, clearly comfortable with children. It was another piece of information about his new partner's background. Someone had socialized this animal well. After the family left, Jace was faced with the practical realities of the situation. He had no feed for Elmer beyond what grass the donkey could find, no water bucket, and no real plan for keeping them both safe through the night. The rest area closed at sunset, which was still a few hours away. But after that, they'd need to find somewhere else to go. He drove to a feed store in the next town, spending $5 of his remaining dollars on a small bag of sweet feed and borrowing a water bucket when he explained his situation to the sympathetic clerk. The woman, whose own family raised horses, gave him directions to a small county park where overnight camping was permitted. "There's good grass there, and a hand pump for water," she said. "Folks pass through all the time with livestock. Just clean up after yourself and nobody'll bother you." The park was exactly as advertised, a simple place with picnic tables, a fire ring, and plenty of open space. Jace parked under a large oak tree and set up what he generously called camp. He filled the water bucket from the hand pump and watched as Elmer drank deeply, then moved off to explore his temporary surroundings. This was when Elmer's personality really began to show itself. The donkey was methodical in his exploration, checking the perimeter of their camping area with the thoroughness of a security guard. When he found a spot that met his approval, a slight rise that offered a good view of the approaches, he settled down with the satisfaction of someone who'd chosen his ground carefully. "You're a cautious one, aren't you?" Jace said, spreading his blanket on the ground near the truck. Elmer's response was to pin his ears back and refuse to come when Jace called him. The donkey was clearly establishing that while he appreciated being rescued from the auction, he wasn't prepared to be pushed around by his new owner. When Jace approached with the halter he'd improvised from the lead rope, Elmer simply walked away. For 20 minutes, they played a slow-motion game of keep-away around the campsite. Elmer stayed just out of reach, not running, but making it clear that he would cooperate on his own terms, or not at all. Jace, tired and frustrated, finally sat down on a fallen log and considered his options. "Look," he said to the donkey, "I don't know what I'm doing here any more than you do, but we're stuck with each other now, so we might as well figure out how to get along." Elmer stopped moving and looked at him with what might have been consideration. Jace pulled a handful of sweet feed from the bag and held it out on his open palm. The donkey's ears came forward, and after a long moment of deliberation, he walked over and delicately ate from Jace's hand. "That's better," Jace said quietly. "We'll take this one step at a time." As darkness fell, they settled into an uneasy routine. Jace spread his blanket under the truck for protection from the dew, while Elmer chose a spot about 20 feet away where he could keep watch. The donkey dozed standing up the way horses did, but Jace noticed that one ear was always moving, constantly monitoring the sounds of the night. It occurred to Jace, lying there looking up at stars, he rarely took time to notice anymore, that he and Elmer were both homeless now, both dependent on the kindness of strangers and the hope that tomorrow would offer better opportunities than today. In the morning, they'd drive to Tommy Breslin's ranch and see if they could make this partnership work. The crumpled business card was still in his shirt pocket, a tangible reminder that sometimes salvation came in the form of honest work and people willing to take a chance on you. Tomorrow would tell whether he and Elmer could earn their keep together, or whether he'd made the most expensive mistake of his broke life. But tonight, for the first time in months, Jace wasn't entirely alone. Tommy Breslin's ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of rolling Texas hill country, with headquarters that had been built by his grandfather in the 1940s. When Jace drove up the gravel road at dawn, Elmer standing alert in the truck bed, Tommy was already waiting by the barn with his morning coffee. "So this is your donkey," Tommy said, walking around the truck to get a better look. "He's bigger than I expected." "Good size for a jack," Jace agreed, lowering the tailgate. "And he's got sense about him." Elmer stepped down from the truck and immediately began assessing his new surroundings: the barn, the corrals, the horses in the nearby pasture, who were watching this newcomer with obvious curiosity. His ears swiveled constantly, taking in sounds and scents, but he stayed calm and alert rather than nervous. "Well, he's got good manners, I'll give you that," Tommy said. "Put him in the back pasture for now. There's water and grass, and if he gets along with my horses, he can stay there as long as you're working." The fence project was straightforward, but labor-intensive. 3 miles of aging barbed wire that needed to be pulled down and replaced with new 4-strand fencing. Tommy provided the materials and equipment. Jace would provide the labor. It was the kind of work that could break a man's back if he wasn't careful. But it was honest pay for honest effort. Jace led Elmer to the designated pasture and turned him loose with Tommy's 3 horses, a sorrel gelding, a paint mare, and an old bay that Tommy kept for sentimental reasons. The horses approached cautiously, sniffing and nickering, while Elmer stood his ground with dignified patience. Within an hour, they'd worked out their hierarchy with minimal fuss, and Elmer had claimed a spot near the water tank that seemed to suit him perfectly. "Looks like they've accepted him," Tommy observed as they loaded fence tools into his pickup. Horses usually know right away if another animal's going to be trouble. The fence line ran along the eastern boundary of the ranch, separating Tommy's cattle from his neighbor's land. The old wire was rusted and sagging, held up more by habit than structural integrity. Jace began at the northernmost corner, working his way south, pulling staples and rolling up the old wire, while Tommy followed behind, setting new posts. It was hard, repetitive work under a Texas sun that showed no mercy. By mid-morning, Jace's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were already showing the cuts and scrapes that came with handling barbed wire. But it felt good to be working again, to have a purpose, beyond just surviving another day. That's when Elmer appeared. Jace was wrestling with a particularly stubborn section of wire when he heard familiar hoofbeats behind him. He turned to see the donkey walking along the fence line, apparently having found a way out of the pasture that Tommy had assured him was escape-proof. "Now how did you get out?" Jace asked, but Elmer just stood there, ears forward, watching the work with apparent interest. Tommy drove up in his pickup, noticed the donkey, and shook his head. "I knew there was a gap in that fence somewhere, but I couldn't find it. Your donkey's got a better eye for weak spots than I do." Instead of trying to put Elmer back in the pasture, Jace decided to see what would happen if he let the donkey stay. It turned out to be one of the better decisions he'd made lately. Elmer positioned himself about 20 feet away from wherever Jace was working, close enough to be helpful, but far enough away to stay out of trouble. When Jace dropped tools, Elmer would investigate and sometimes pick them up in his teeth, not exactly returning them, but at least keeping them in sight. When Jace moved to a new section of fence, Elmer followed, settling into a new observation post with the patience of a foreman overseeing a job site. "That donkey's appointed himself supervisor," Tommy said during their lunch break. "Never seen anything like it." But Elmer's real value became apparent when they started stringing the new wire. The job required someone to hold tension on one end while the other person stapled the wire to posts. Usually, this meant constant trips back and forth, or hiring a second worker. But Elmer seemed to understand the process intuitively. When Jace hooked the wire to Elmer's halter, more as an experiment than anything else, the donkey backed up slowly, maintaining steady pressure while Jace worked his way down the fence line. If the wire needed more tension, Jace could call back, and Elmer would step backward. When there was enough slack, Woe would bring him to a standstill. "I'll be damned," Tommy said, watching this demonstration. "Where'd you teach him to do that?" "I didn't," Jace replied, as surprised as anyone. "He's figuring it out on his own." By the end of the first day, they'd completed nearly half a mile of fence, double what Jace had expected to accomplish working alone. Elmer had proven himself not just tolerable, but genuinely useful. More than that, he'd seemed to enjoy the work, approaching each new section with the enthusiasm of someone who appreciated having a job to do. The other workers, Tommy hired for larger projects, began stopping by to see the cowboy and his donkey. Some were amused, others skeptical, but all were impressed by how efficiently the odd partnership functioned. "You could hire that donkey out," joked Miguel Santos, who ran cattle for the neighboring ranch. "Probably more reliable than half the hands I work with." As the days passed, Jace and Elmer developed routines that felt natural and unforced. Morning care, checking Elmer's feet, brushing him down, making sure he had water. Work time, the donkey following along, helping with tasks that fit his abilities, staying out of the way when they didn't. Evening, quiet conversation, while Jace tended to equipment and Elmer grazed or simply stood nearby, companionable in the gathering dusk. It was during these evening conversations that Jace found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed with anyone in years, about Marcus and the mistakes that had driven them apart, about the rodeo years and what it felt like to have everything and then watch it slip away, about the loneliness of sleeping in truck cabs and the shame of having to count quarters for coffee. Elmer listened without judgment, occasionally moving closer or reaching out to touch Jace's shoulder with his nose. It wasn't advice or sympathy exactly, but it was presence, the simple comfort of not being alone with thoughts that had grown too heavy to carry by himself. On the fourth day, Jace found one of his work gloves had fallen beside a fence post and been left behind. The leather was worn soft from use, stained with honest sweat and shaped by hard work. When he went back to retrieve it, the glove was gone, but he found Elmer standing nearby, the missing glove at his feet, as if the donkey had brought it to a safe place and waited for Jace to return. "You're looking out for me, aren't you, old man?" Jace said, picking up the weathered glove. Elmer's response was to nudge Jace's pocket, where he'd learned the sweet feed was kept. It was a fair trade, companionship and partnership in exchange for care and purpose. Both of them were earning their keep, and both of them were finally exactly where they belonged. 3 weeks into their partnership, Jace had settled into a rhythm with Elmer that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced in years. They'd finished Tommy Breslin's fence project and moved on to a job 40 miles south, helping an elderly rancher named Carl Morrison repair cattle, guards and replace rotted posts on his boundary lines. Carl had been impressed. Enough with their work to offer them a spot in his old bunkhouse, a 2-room building that hadn't been used in years but still had running water and electricity. For the first time since losing his apartment, Jace slept in an actual bed while Elmer settled into a paddock behind the bunkhouse with obvious satisfaction. It was in the evenings, sitting on the bunkhouse porch while Elmer grazed nearby, that Jace found himself talking about Marcus. Maybe it was the donkey's patient presence, or maybe it was the relief of having steady work and a roof over his head. But the words came easier than they had in years. "He was 8 the first time I took him to a rodeo," Jace said, reaching into his wallet to pull out a faded photograph he'd carried for 21 years. The picture showed a gap-toothed boy in miniature Wranglers and a too-big cowboy hat, standing beside a bucking chute with pure joy written across his face. Elmer wandered closer, as if sensing the significance of the moment, and stood quietly while Jace studied the photograph in the fading light. "Look at that smile," Jace continued. He was so excited to be there, to be part of what Daddy did for a living. "I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive, good at my job, making decent money, and my boy thought I hung the moon." The photograph was creased from years in Jace's wallet, and the colors had faded until Marcus's red shirt looked more pink than crimson. But the boy's expression was still vivid, pure hero worship directed at a father who seemed larger than life. I started taking him to more rodeos after that. Figured it was good for him to see what real work looked like, to understand what it meant to earn a living doing something you loved. He'd help me with my gear, carry my rope, sometimes even help me practice my runs when we got home. Elmer moved closer still, close enough that Jace could reach out and stroke the donkey's neck while he talked. There was something about the animal's calm presence that made it easier to revisit memories that usually brought nothing but pain. For a while there, it was perfect. Marcus knew every cowboy on the circuit, could tell you which bulls were rank and which horses were smooth as silk. He had this little rope, and he'd practiced team roping with a hay bale for hours. I thought maybe he'd follow in my footsteps, make it a family tradition. The memory of those days still brought a warmth to Jace's chest, even knowing how the story ended. Marcus had been his shadow then, his biggest fan and most devoted student. They'd shared something special, a bond built around shared purpose and mutual respect. But then I started winning bigger, traveling more. There were endorsement deals and magazine interviews, and suddenly I was gone more than I was home. Marcus would ask when I was coming back, and I'd promise it would be soon, but there was always one more rodeo, one more chance to add to my earnings. The photograph trembled slightly in Jace's hands as he remembered the gradual change in Marcus's face during those visits home. The excitement dimming, replaced first by disappointment, then resignation, and finally by the polite distance that had eventually grown into complete estrangement. His mother started going to his school events alone, his baseball games, his school plays. I kept meaning to be there, but there was always something else. Always some reason why the rodeo had to come first. Elmer snorted softly and moved even closer until he was standing directly beside Jace's chair. The donkey seemed to sense his human's distress and was offering what comfort he could, simple presence and unwavering attention. The worst part was, I convinced myself I was doing it for them, building a nest egg, setting up our future. But really I was doing it for me. For the crowds and the prize money and the feeling of being somebody special. I was addicted to it, the adrenaline, the competition, the way people looked at me when I was on top. A truck passed on the distant highway, its headlights sweeping across the pasture before disappearing into the darkness. Jace folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into his wallet, but the memories continued to flow. Marcus was 16 when I finally quit competing. 16, and we barely knew each other anymore. I'd been gone so much during those years that I was like a stranger in my own house. He had his own friends, his own interests, and none of them included me. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of night insects and Elmer's gentle breathing. Jace had never told this story to anyone, not in its entirety. Not with all the painful details that explained how a champion cowboy had ended up sleeping in truck stops. I tried to make it up to him after I retired. Went to every game, every school event I could find, but it was too late by then. He was polite, respectful even, but the hero worship was gone. I was just his father, the man who'd chosen rodeo over family for the better part of a decade. Elmer reached out with his nose and gently touched Jace's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that seemed almost human in its timing and tenderness. The donkey had learned to read his moods, to offer companionship when it was needed most. The divorce was final when Marcus turned 18. He went off to college and I made one bad decision after another. Lost the house, lost my savings, lost pretty much everything except my pride. And pride, it turns out, doesn't pay the bills or keep you warm at night. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, and Elmer's ears swiveled toward the sound. But the donkey didn't move away from Jace's side. If anything, he seemed to position himself protectively, ready to defend against any threat to their small sanctuary. Marcus tried to help, you know. After college, when he got his first real job, he'd call and offer to send money, ask if I needed anything. But I was too proud to take help from my own son, too ashamed to admit that the great Jace Duvall couldn't take care of himself. The final conversation with Marcus played through Jace's mind like a broken record. Hard words spoken in anger, accusations and counter-accusations that had burned bridges Jace had never figured out how to rebuild. Pride and stubbornness on both sides, until the silence became easier than trying to heal wounds that seemed too deep to mend. Last thing he said to me was that I'd spent his whole life choosing everything else over family, and he was done waiting for me to change. That was 5 years ago, and I haven't heard from him since. Elmer stood quietly beside him, a solid presence in the darkness. Tomorrow, there would be fence posts to set and wire to string, honest work that kept both man and donkey fed and sheltered. But tonight, in the soft Texas darkness, it was enough to have someone to talk to who listened without judgment and offered comfort without conditions. Jace discovered the wedding announcement by accident, the way most painful truths seem to find him these days. He'd stopped at Miller's feed store in Bandera to pick up supplements for Elmer when he noticed a familiar name in the local newspaper's engagement section: Marcus James Duvall and Sarah Elizabeth. Chen announced their engagement, the small print read, followed by a paragraph about their careers and wedding plans. There was even a photograph, Marcus in a suit and tie, looking prosperous and happy beside a beautiful young woman with kind eyes. Jace stood in the feed store parking lot, the newspaper trembling in his hands while Elmer waited patiently in the truck bed. His son was getting married, 29 years old, successful enough to make the society page. And Jace had learned about it from a newspaper in a town 60 miles from where Marcus lived. The drive back to Carl Morrison's ranch passed in a blur. Jace found himself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual, watching Elmer's reaction to his obvious distress. The donkey stood steadier than usual in the truck bed, as if he sensed his human needed extra stability today. That evening, Jace sat on the bunkhouse porch with the newspaper folded open to Marcus's engagement announcement, reading and rereading the brief details of his son's life. Marcus worked as an electrical engineer for a company that designed wind farms. Sarah was a pediatric nurse. They met at a charity 5K run and shared interests in hiking and volunteer work. It was the life of a man Jace didn't know, responsible, community-minded, settled. The kind of man who'd learned to build his happiness without waiting for an absent father to provide it. "Look at that," Jace said to Elmer, holding up the photograph. "He turned out fine without me." "Better than fine." Elmer moved closer to investigate the newspaper, then looked at Jace with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his heart. The donkey had become attuned to his moods over the past month, offering companionship when Jace was sad, staying close when he was troubled, providing a steady presence that asked for nothing but care and honesty in return. "Weddings in 3 months," Jace continued, though his voice caught slightly on the words. "October 15th at some church in Austin. Probably cost more than I've made in the last 2 years. He reached for his cell phone, an ancient model with a cracked screen that he'd been nursing along for 3 years, because he couldn't afford to replace it. The screen flickered when he turned it on, displaying Marcus's number in the contact list where it had sat unused for 5 years. How many times had he scrolled to that number and stared at it, thumb hovering over the call button? How many conversations had he practiced in his head, trying to find words that might bridge the gap between them? But pride and shame made a potent combination, keeping him paralyzed between wanting to reach out and fearing the rejection that seemed inevitable. "What would I even say?" Jace asked Elmer. "Congratulations on your engagement, and by the way, I'm living in a bunkhouse with a donkey. That I finally figured out what really matters, about 5 years too late." Elmer stepped closer and rested his chin on the porch railing, close enough that Jace could feel the warmth of his breath. The donkey's presence was grounding, a reminder that connection didn't always require words or explanations. Sometimes it was enough just to show up, to be present and reliable. The next morning brought a new challenge that temporarily distracted Jace from his family troubles. Carl Morrison's prize bull had somehow gotten into the neighbor's pasture and was terrorizing a herd of Angus cows that wanted nothing to do with the amorous intruder. Getting the bull back where he belonged would require careful handling and no small amount of luck. "That son of a gun jumped a 5-foot fence," Carl said, shaking his head as they surveyed the situation. "Now he's got those poor cows running in circles, and their owner's madder than a wet hen." The neighbor in question was Vernon Hicks, a 78-year-old rancher who'd been working cattle since before Jace was born. Vernon had called that morning threatening everything from lawsuits to buckshot if his cows were harmed by Carl's lovesick bull. "Let me talk to him," Jace offered. "Maybe we can work something out." Vernon turned out to be exactly what Jace expected, a weathered man with sharp eyes and no patience for foolishness. But he also recognized competence when he saw it. And after watching Jace and Elmer work together to separate the bull from his cows, his attitude softened considerably. "That's some donkey you got there," Vernon said, as they guided the bull toward the fence line. "Man knows his business, doesn't get rattled." "Where'd you find him?" "County auction," Jace replied. "Nobody wanted him but me." "Sometimes the best partnerships start that way," Vernon observed. "Two misfits who figure out they're better together than apart." They managed to get the bull back to Carl's pasture without incident, using a combination of patience, persistence, and Elmer's natural ability to read cattle behavior. The donkey seemed to understand instinctively how to position himself to encourage movement without causing panic. Afterward, Vernon invited them to sit on his porch and share a beer while the sun set over the hill country. It was the kind of moment Jace had learned to appreciate. Honest work completed, animals safely tended, and the companionship of men who understood the value of both. "You know," Vernon said, settling into his rocking chair with a satisfied sigh, "I've been married to the same woman for 52 years, and raised 3 kids who all live within an hour of here. You want to know the secret?" Jace waited, sensing this was leading somewhere important. "Pride's a cold bedfellow in old age," Vernon continued. "Whatever mistakes you've made, whatever words you've said that can't be taken back, none of that matters as much as showing up. People remember who was there when it counted." The old man's words hit closer to home than Jace was comfortable with, but he found himself nodding anyway. "Sometimes it feels like too much time has passed, like the damage is too deep to fix." "Maybe it is," Vernon said with characteristic bluntness. "But you won't know unless you try. And the trying, that's what matters, even if it doesn't work out the way you hope." That night, Jace sat on the bunkhouse porch with his cracked phone in his hands, and Marcus's engagement announcement spread across his lap. Elmer stood nearby, patient and watchful, ready to offer comfort if it was needed. The phone's screen flickered as Jace scrolled to Marcus's number, his thumb hovering over the call button once again. 5 years of silence stretched between them. 5 years of pride and stubbornness that had cost them both more than either was willing to admit. But tomorrow was another day, and Vernon's words echoed in his mind. Showing up was what mattered, even when you weren't sure you'd be welcome. Even when the conversation might be the hardest one you'd ever tried to have. Elmer moved closer, offering his steady presence as Jace wrestled with decisions that seemed too big for one broken-down cowboy to make alone. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he didn't have to make them alone anymore. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, forwarded through a chain of people who'd known where to find Jace, even when he'd lost track of himself. Carl Morrison handed it to him over breakfast, along with a knowing look that suggested he understood the significance of formal correspondence arriving for a man who lived in a bunkhouse. "Came to my neighbor's place first," Carl explained. "The postman knows you've been working around here, so he asked them to pass it along." Jace recognized his ex-wife's handwriting on the forwarding label, which meant she'd received it at the old address and taken the trouble to track him down. That alone was enough to make his hands shake as he carried the envelope outside to read in private. Elmer was waiting by the paddock fence, alert to the change in Jace's routine. The donkey had learned to read his human's moods with uncanny accuracy, and something about the formal envelope had clearly caught his attention. "Let's see what this is about." "Old man," Jace said, settling onto the porch steps with Elmer standing nearby. The envelope was cream-colored and expensive, with elegant script that spelled out his name and former address. Inside was a wedding invitation, thick cardstock with gold embossing that announced the marriage of Marcus James Duvall and Sarah Elizabeth Chen. October 15th at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Austin, with reception to follow at the Driscoll Hotel. But it was the handwritten note tucked inside that stopped Jace's heart. "Dad, I know we haven't talked in a long time, and I know there's a lot of hurt between us, but you're my father, and I want you at my wedding, if you're willing to come. We need to talk, and this seemed like the right time to try. I hope you're well, wherever you are. Please come if you can. Marcus." Jace read the note 3 times before the words fully registered. Marcus had been looking for him, had wanted him there all along. The engagement announcement in the newspaper had been public information, But this was personal. This was his son, reaching across 5 years of silence, with an invitation that must have taken considerable courage to send. "He wants me there," Jace said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Elmer moved closer, sensing his human's emotional state and offering the comfort of his presence. "After everything I did, everything I didn't do, he still wants me at his wedding." The implications hit him in waves. First, relief, so profound it left him lightheaded. Marcus didn't hate him. The silence hadn't been about hatred, but about hurt, and hurt could be healed. Then came the panic. How could he show up at his son's wedding looking like what he'd become? Living in a bunkhouse, driving a 15-year-old truck, owning nothing but the clothes on his back and a donkey he'd bought at auction. Marcus was marrying a pediatric nurse, surrounded by successful friends and colleagues. He worked for a respected company, lived in Austin, moved in circles where people wore suits and attended charity functions. What would he think of his father now? Broke, displaced, dependent on the kindness of ranchers for work and shelter. "I can't," Jace said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Look at me, Elmer, look at us. I'm 54 years old, and everything I own fits in the back of a pickup truck. How can I walk into that church and face him like this?" Elmer snorted and nudged Jace's shoulder with his nose, a gesture that had become their signal for pay attention. The donkey's dark eyes were steady and patient, carrying a wisdom that seemed older than his 12 years. "You think I should go, don't you?" Jace asked. "You think I should swallow my pride and show up anyway?" The truth was, he dreamed of this moment for 5 years, the chance to make things right with Marcus, to bridge the gap that pride and stubbornness had created between them. But in his dreams, he'd always been successful again, respectable, able to approach his son as an equal, rather than a failure seeking forgiveness. He pulled out his phone and stared at Marcus's number, the invitation trembling in his other hand. One phone call could confirm his attendance, could start the conversation he'd been too afraid to initiate. But it could also open him up to rejection, to the possibility that Marcus would take one look at what his father had become and regret his generosity. The morning stretched on as Jace wrestled with his decision. He helped Carl move cattle to a new pasture, repaired a broken gate, and cleaned out water troughs, physical work that usually helped him think clearly. But today, every task felt mechanical, performed while his mind raced through scenarios and conversations that might never happen. Elmer stayed closer than usual, abandoning his normal routine of exploring the pasture to remain within sight of Jace throughout the day. The donkey seemed to sense the magnitude of the decision his human was facing and appointed himself guardian and confidant. That evening, as the sun set over the hill country, Jace found himself telling Elmer about the wedding invitation and the impossible choice it represented. "He's getting married at the Driscoll Hotel," Jace said, reading from the invitation again. "Do you know what that place costs? The cheapest room there is more than I make in a month. His friends are going to be doctors and engineers, people with 401ks and vacation homes. What am I supposed to tell them when they ask what I do for a living?" Elmer listened with his usual patience, occasionally moving closer or touching Jace's arm with his nose. But tonight, there was something different in the donkey's behavior, a persistence that suggested he had strong opinions about the situation. When Jace got up to go inside, Elmer blocked his path. When he tried to walk around, the donkey moved to block him again. It became a gentle but determined standoff, with Elmer clearly communicating that this conversation wasn't over. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jace asked, frustrated but touched by the animal's concern. Elmer walked to the fence and stood beside the gate, looking back at Jace with unmistakable intent. Then he returned and repeated the gesture, as if demonstrating something important. "You're telling me to go," Jace realized. "You're saying I should walk through that gate, even though I'm scared of what's on the other side." The donkey's ears came forward, and he touched Jace's shoulder with his nose, approval and encouragement combined in one gentle gesture. Jace looked at the invitation again, reading his son's handwritten words one more time. "We need to talk," and this seemed like the right time to try. Marcus had been brave enough to reach out, to risk his own rejection in the hope of healing their relationship. Maybe it was time for Jace to show the same courage. "You're right," he said to Elmer. "I can't let pride keep me away from my son's wedding. Whatever happens, whatever he thinks of what I've become, at least I'll be there. At least I'll be trying." The decision once made brought a sense of relief he hadn't expected. There would be details to work out. What to wear, where to stay, what to say after 5 years of silence. But those were practical problems with practical solutions. The important thing was the choice itself. To show up, to be present, to try. Elmer seemed to sense the shift in Jace's mood. The donkey's posture relaxed, and he moved closer, resting his chin on the porch railing in a gesture of quiet companionship. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Jace said, stroking the donkey's neck. "You've been my conscience and my courage when I couldn't find either one on my own." Tomorrow he would call Marcus. Tomorrow he would start planning for a wedding that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. But tonight he had Elmer's steady presence and the first real hope he'd felt in years that some bridges could still be rebuilt, even after they'd been burned to the ground. The phone call to Marcus took Jace 3 attempts to complete. Twice he dialed the number and hung up before it could ring, his nerve failing at the last moment. On the 3rd try, with Elmer standing beside him as moral support, he forced himself to let it ring. "Hello?" Marcus's voice was older, deeper than Jace remembered, but unmistakably his son. "Marcus, it's your father." A pause that lasted forever. "Then, Dad, where are you? I've been trying to find you for months." "I got your invitation," Jace said, bypassing the question about his location. "I'd like to come if the offer's still open." "Of course it's open. I wouldn't have sent it if I didn't mean it." Marcus's voice carried relief, and something that might have been joy. "Are you okay? Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm fine," Jace lied smoothly. "Working a ranch job in the hill country. I've got a lot to tell you when I see you." They talked for 20 minutes, carefully avoiding the minefield of their shared history while discussing practical details. Marcus would make arrangements for his father's hotel room. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Sarah was excited to meet him, had heard stories about the famous rodeo cowboy, and was looking forward to putting a face with the legend. "I'm proud of you," Jace said before they hung up. "The work you're doing, the life you've built, I know I don't have the right to say that, but I am." "You do have the right," Marcus replied quietly. "You're my father. That never changed, even when everything else did." After the call, Jace sat on the bunkhouse porch with his hands shaking from adrenaline and emotion. The conversation had gone better than his worst fears, but had revealed new challenges. Marcus was expecting the father he remembered. Successful, confident, larger than life. Not the broken-down cowboy who'd spent the last year sleeping in his truck. "I need to clean up my act," he told Elmer. "Need to look like somebody worth knowing when I walk into that church." Carl Morrison, when approached about taking a few days off, was surprisingly understanding. "Family comes first," he said simply. "The work will be here when you get back, and so will your room if you want it." The trip to Austin would take most of a day, with Elmer riding in the truck bed as usual. But first, Jace needed to address the practical problem of his appearance. His best clothes were worn and outdated, suitable for ranch work, but not for a wedding at one of Austin's finest hotels. The solution came from an unexpected source. Carl's late wife had been roughly Jace's size, and her closet still contained several of her husband's dress shirts and jackets from their younger days. Carl offered them with the gruff kindness of a man who understood what it meant to have nothing. "Helen always said good clothes were wasted on folks who didn't appreciate them," Carl said, pressing a navy blazer into Jace's hands. She'd be pleased to know they were helping someone get to their son's wedding. Jace also made a pilgrimage to his storage unit in San Antonio, the last vestige of his former life that he'd managed to keep paying for, month by month, even when it meant skipping meals. Most of the unit contained junk he should have thrown away years ago, but buried in the back was a small wooden box he'd forgotten about. The box was rough around the edges, clearly the work of amateur hands, but it had been made with love 25 years ago when Marcus was 4 years old. Jace had carved it during the off-season, working on it in the evenings while his son played with toy trucks on the workshop floor. It was meant to hold Marcus's treasures, rocks and bottle caps, and the important debris of childhood. "Remember this?" Jace asked Elmer, holding up the box. The donkey sniffed it curiously, but seemed more interested in the emotions it triggered in his human than in the object itself. Inside the box were a few items Jace had saved from Marcus's childhood: a dried corsage from his first school dance, a participation ribbon from a track meet, a hand-drawn birthday card that said, "To the best dad in the world," in crayon letters. Jace had forgotten he'd kept these things, and finding them now felt like discovering buried treasure. The drive to Austin began before dawn on the Friday before the wedding. Jace had cleaned his truck inside and out, and Elmer stood alert in the bed, ears forward as they joined the highway traffic, heading toward the state capital. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled east, from the rocky hills of the Edwards Plateau to the rolling country around Austin. Jace found himself remembering other trips along this route, back when he'd been traveling to rodeos with a horse trailer behind him and Marcus in the passenger seat. "We used to stop at that gas station," he told Elmer, pointing to a travel center near Dripping Springs. "Marcus would get beef jerky and Dr. Pepper, and I'd let him practice his rope tricks in the parking lot while I checked the horses. Every mile brought back memories. Some good, some painful, all vivid enough to make the past feel more real than the present. There was the restaurant where they'd celebrated Marcus's 13th birthday, when Jace was home between rodeos and trying to make up for missed time. The roadside park where they'd stopped to let the horses rest and drink, where Marcus had asked why Daddy was always leaving and when he'd be home for good. By the time they reached Austin's outskirts, Jace's stomach was twisted with anxiety and anticipation. The city had grown enormously since his last visit, sprawling in all directions with new subdivisions and shopping centers that hadn't existed 5 years ago. But downtown still looked familiar. The Capitol building rising above the Colorado River, the mix of old and new architecture that gave Austin its unique character. Finding the hotel was easier than expected, but parking a pickup truck with a donkey in the bed presented unique challenges. The Driscoll Hotel's valet staff had clearly never encountered this particular situation, but they handled it with professional grace, directing Jace to a service area where Elmer could be secure and comfortable. "Is that your therapy animal?" the young valet asked, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. "Something like that," Jace replied, which was probably the truest thing he'd said all day. The hotel room Marcus had reserved was modest but elegant, with a view of downtown and amenities that felt luxurious after months of bunkhouse living. Jace sat on the bed and called Marcus to confirm his arrival, then spent the rest of the afternoon wrestling with his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Carl's blazer fit well enough, and the dress shirt was clean and pressed. His boots were old, but well-maintained, and his belt buckle, not the tarnished championship buckle, but a simpler one he'd bought years ago, completed the outfit respectably. But it was his face that worried him most. The lines were deeper than he remembered, etched by years of outdoor work and financial stress. His hair had more grey than brown now, and his hands showed the permanent stains and calluses of manual labor. "This is who I am now," he told his reflection. "Not the champion Marcus remembers, but not a complete failure either. Just a man trying to do better." That evening, he walked to a nearby restaurant for dinner, leaving Elmer settled in the hotel's service area with hay and water provided by the surprisingly accommodating staff. Austin's streets were busy with Friday night crowds, young professionals, college students, tourists drawn by the city's famous music scene. Jace felt simultaneously invisible and exposed, just another older man in a modest suit among the trendy restaurants and craft cocktail bars. He ate alone, studying the other diners and trying to imagine what Marcus's life might look like. Did he come to places like this regularly? Did he have favorite restaurants? A social circle of friends from work and neighborhood? The son, Jace, had once known loved hamburgers and chocolate milk, played with action figures, and wanted to be a cowboy like his dad. That boy had grown into a man Jace barely knew, and tomorrow he'd be expected to celebrate that man's most important day. Back at the hotel, Jace called to check on Elmer and found the donkey contentedly munching hay while being admired by hotel guests who discovered him during their evening walks. The night manager, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at the Driscoll for 20 years, reported that Elmer was a perfect gentleman and had attracted quite a fan club. "He's very calm," she said. "Some of our guests have been taking selfies with him. I hope that's all right. We've never had a donkey stay with us before." Alone in his room, Jace opened the wooden box and examined the childhood mementos he'd brought. Tomorrow, he would see Marcus for the first time in 5 years, meet the woman his son loved, and try to begin rebuilding a relationship that had been broken by pride and misunderstanding. The hand-carved box sat on the nightstand beside his bed, a tangible reminder of love that had persevered despite everything that had gone wrong. Marcus had treasured this box once, had filled it with the important discoveries of childhood. Maybe tomorrow Jace would have the courage to give it back to him, along with all the apologies and explanations he'd been rehearsing for years. Outside his window, Austin glittered in the Texas night. Somewhere in the city, Marcus was probably spending his last evening as a single man, surrounded by friends and family who'd watched him grow into the successful, principled man he'd become. Tomorrow, if everything went right, Jace would be part of that celebration, not as the absent father who'd missed too much, but as the man he was trying to become. Jace woke at dawn on the morning of the wedding, his internal clock still set to ranch time despite the hotel room's heavy curtains. The carved wooden box sat on the nightstand where he'd left it, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was or why his chest felt so tight with anticipation. Then it all came rushing back. Marcus, the wedding, the impossible hope that 5 years of silence might be bridged by a single conversation. He showered carefully, shaved twice to make sure he'd gotten every whisker, and dressed in Carl Morrison's borrowed blazer with the slow precision of a man preparing for battle. The boutonniere he'd bought at a florist shop the night before, a simple white rose with baby's breath, seemed absurdly formal, pinned to his lapel. But it was what the wedding required. "Wish me luck." "Old man," he said to Elmer when he stopped to check on him before leaving for the church. The donkey was surrounded by a small group of hotel guests who'd come down early specifically to visit with him. Elmer seemed to enjoy the attention, standing patiently while children petted his nose and adults took photographs. "Your donkey's been the hit of the weekend," Patricia, the night manager, told him. "We've had 3 people ask if we regularly accommodate livestock. I think you've started a new trend." St. Matthew's Episcopal Church was a limestone Gothic revival building in downtown Austin, with tall, arched windows and a bell tower that commanded respect. Jace parked across the street and sat in his truck for 10 minutes, watching the early arrivals make their way up the front steps. Everyone looked prosperous and confident, the kind of people who belonged at weddings in expensive hotels, who sent their children to good colleges and took vacations in Europe. When he finally forced himself to cross the street and climb the church steps, Jace felt like an imposter in his borrowed clothes. But the usher at the door, a young man about Marcus's age, greeted him warmly and asked if he was with the bride or groom. "Groom," Jace said. "I'm his father." The usher's face lit up with recognition. "Mr. Duvall, Marcus has been watching for you. He's still getting ready, but he said to tell you he'll see you before the ceremony starts." Jace was escorted to a pew in the front section reserved for family, where he found himself sitting next to his ex-wife Linda for the first time in 7 years. She looked good, older, grayer, but healthy and well-dressed. Her surprise at seeing him was obvious, but not unwelcoming. "Jace," she said simply, "I'm glad you came." "He invited me," Jace replied, as if that explained everything. "I know. I helped him find you." Linda studied his face with the frank assessment of someone who'd once known him better than anyone. "You look different. Older, but I don't know. More settled, maybe." Before Jace could respond, Marcus appeared at the end of their pew. 29 years old, wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Jace's truck, but unmistakably his son. Taller than Jace remembered, broader in the shoulders, with the confident bearing of a man who'd found his place in the world. "Dad." Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes showed the same mix of hope and uncertainty that Jace felt. "Son." Jace stood and extended his hand, then found himself pulled into an embrace that lasted longer than either of them had expected. Marcus smelled like expensive cologne and nervous sweat, and when they separated, both men's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You clean up pretty good for an old cowboy," Marcus said, straightening Jace's boutonniere with the same gentle attention he'd shown as a child. "Your mother always said I scrubbed up decent when I made the effort." "I wasn't sure you'd come," Marcus admitted quietly. "After all this time, I almost didn't," Jace replied honestly. "But sometimes you have to take a chance on family, even when you're not sure how it'll turn out." The organist began playing, signaling that the ceremony was about to start. Marcus squeezed his father's shoulder and returned to his position at the front of the church, leaving Jace to process what had just happened. His son had grown into a good man, kind, successful, generous enough to forgive an absent father who'd finally learned to show up when it mattered. The wedding ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Sarah was radiant in ivory silk, carrying white roses that matched Jace's boutonniere. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, her father's voice rang out clearly, "Her mother and I do." When he asked the same of Marcus, Jace felt a moment of panic. Was he supposed to respond? But the tradition had evolved, and Marcus simply nodded to acknowledge the family that had shaped him. Watching his son exchange vows with a woman who clearly adored him, Jace felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly. Marcus had chosen well and built a life worth celebrating. Regret, too, for all the moments he'd missed. All the years when his son had been becoming this remarkable man without his father's witness or support. But mostly, he felt gratitude. Gratitude that Marcus had grown up to be someone Jace could respect and admire. Gratitude that his son had been generous enough to invite him back into his life. And gratitude for Elmer, whose patient presence had taught him that sometimes the most broken hearts really could recognize each other and heal together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and joy. Marcus kissed his bride, then turned to face the congregation with a smile that could have powered the city. His eyes found Jace's across the crowded church, and for a moment it was just the two of them, father and son, connected again after too many years of silence. The reception at the Driscoll Hotel was everything Jace had imagined and feared. Elegant, expensive, and filled with people who moved in circles he'd never belonged to. The ballroom was decorated with white flowers and soft lighting, and a jazz quartet played softly while guests mingled with champagne and conversation. Jace found himself standing near the bar, nursing a beer and trying to look comfortable while Marcus and Sarah made their rounds greeting guests. Several people had introduced themselves. Colleagues from Marcus's work, Sarah's family from Houston, friends from college. Everyone was polite, but Jace could see the curiosity in their eyes when they learned he was the groom's father. "You must be so proud," said a woman who introduced herself as Sarah's mother. "Marcus is such a wonderful young man. He speaks of you often." Jace doubted that was entirely true, but he appreciated the kindness. "He turned out better than I had any right to expect," he replied honestly. It was during the dinner service that Marcus finally found a moment to steal away with his father. He approached Jace's table, where he'd been seated with Linda and a few distant relatives, and leaned down to whisper, "Can you spare a few minutes? There's something I want to show you." They slipped out of the ballroom and took the elevator to the mezzanine level, where Marcus led the way to a quiet corner with overstuffed chairs and a view of downtown Austin. A waiter appeared as if by magic, bringing 2 glasses of bourbon without being asked. "I remembered you used to drink Maker's Mark," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from his father. Figured this was a conversation that called for something stronger than wedding champagne. Jace accepted the glass gratefully, noting that his hands were steadier than they'd been all day. To your marriage, he said, raising his glass. Sarah seems like a remarkable woman. She is, Marcus agreed, but he didn't drink yet. Dad, we need to talk about what happened between us. About why I stopped calling, why you stopped trying to reach out. Here it was, the conversation Jace had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I know I failed you, he began, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. Let me go first, Marcus said. I've been practicing this speech for months, ever since I decided to invite you. He took a sip of bourbon and gathered his thoughts. I was angry for a long time. Angry that you chose rodeo over family, that you missed so many important things, that you seemed to care more about winning than about being a father, Jace nodded. Accepting the indictment because it was true, but I was also prideful, Marcus continued. When you tried to make it up to me after you retired, I punished you for all those years of absence. I held onto my resentment because it felt safer than risking disappointment again. You had every right to be angry, Jace said quietly. I made choices that hurt you and your mother, and I can't take those back, I know. But I made choices too. Choices to cut you out, rather than try to rebuild something new. When we had that fight 5 years ago, I said things that were meant to hurt you. I wanted you to feel as rejected as I'd felt growing up. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of honest admission settling between them. The jazz quartet was audible from the ballroom below, a gentle soundtrack to this painful and necessary conversation. I tried to find you, Marcus said. About 2 years ago, when Sarah and I got serious and I started thinking about family differently, I wanted to apologize to see if we could start over. But you disappeared. No forwarding address, no phone number that worked. I was ashamed, Jace admitted. Lost everything. The house, my savings, most of my self-respect. I didn't want you to see what I'd become. What had you become? Jace gestured toward the window, where his pickup truck was parked on the street below. A broke cowboy living in his truck, taking whatever work he could find. Hardly the father you deserve to be proud of. Marcus followed his gaze and spotted the truck with its distinctive occupant. Is that a donkey in the back of your pickup? That's Elmer, Jace said, unable to suppress a smile. Bought him at a county auction with my last $23. Best investment I ever made. Tell me about him. So Jace did. He told Marcus about the auction, about Elmer's stubborn dignity, about how they'd learned to work together and take care of each other. He told him about the fence jobs and the small ranches, about sleeping under stars and finding purpose in simple, honest work. He sounds like quite a partner, Marcus said when the story was finished. He saved my life, Jace said simply. Not in any dramatic way, but by giving me something to care about when I'd given up on caring about myself. By teaching me that sometimes the most broken things can still be useful, still be worth saving. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face. You're different, he said finally. Calmer somehow, more present. I learned some things the hard way. About what really matters, about the difference between being important and being useful. Jace raised his glass again. To my son, who had the courage to invite his broken-down father to his wedding, and to trust that love might be stronger than pride. They drank to that, and when they set down their glasses, something fundamental had shifted between them. Not complete healing, that would take time, but the beginning of understanding. I want you to meet Sarah properly, Marcus said. And I want to hear more about this donkey who saved your life. But first, I want to say something I should have said years ago. I'm sorry, Dad, for the cruel things I said, for cutting you out of my life, for not trying harder to find you sooner. And I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved when it mattered most, Jace replied. For putting my own needs ahead of yours. For letting pride keep me away when you needed me to fight for our relationship. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the hotel windows. Tomorrow would bring practical conversations about the future, about how to rebuild a relationship that had been dormant for 5 years. But tonight, for the first time since Marcus was a child, they were simply father and son, sharing bourbon and honest conversation on the most important day of Marcus's life. 6 months after the wedding, Jace woke in a real bed, in a real apartment, for the 180th consecutive day. Not that he was counting. But the novelty of consistent shelter hadn't worn off yet. Sunlight streamed through actual curtains instead of a cracked windshield, and the smell of coffee brewing in an actual kitchen had replaced the aroma of truck stop. Breakfast. The apartment was small, 2 rooms and a bathroom in a complex on Austin's east side that catered to working folks rather than tech millionaires. But it had everything Jace needed: a bed, a table where he could eat meals and pay bills, and a window that looked out on the pasture where Elmer spent his days. Elmer's situation had improved even more dramatically than Jace's. The donkey now lived in a paddock behind Sunset Stables, where Jace worked as assistant manager and part-time instructor. The job had come through Sarah's connections. Her childhood riding instructor owned the stable and needed help with someone who understood both horses and people. When she'd mentioned that the applicant came with a donkey partner, it had sealed the deal rather than hurt it. "Adds character to the place," Martha Hendricks had said after meeting Elmer. "Kids love him, and he's got better sense about horses than most people I've hired." The work was perfect for both of them. Jace taught basic horsemanship to children and nervous adults, maintained equipment, and helped with the therapeutic riding program for disabled children. Elmer served as a mascot, confidence builder, and general goodwill ambassador, beloved by students and staff alike. This morning was special. It was Sunday, which meant dinner at Marcus and Sarah's house. The weekly tradition had started tentatively, with careful conversations and gradual rebuilding of trust. But 6 months in, it felt natural and comfortable, the way family dinners were supposed to feel. Jace drove through Austin traffic, with Elmer riding contentedly in a proper horse trailer that Martha had insisted they buy for stable business. The donkey had adapted to city life with surprising grace, seeming to enjoy the variety of sights and sounds compared to their old routine of rural isolation. Marcus and Sarah's house was a modest bungalow in South Austin, with a small yard that Sarah had turned into a garden and a detached garage that Marcus had converted into a workshop. It was the kind of home that spoke of careful choices and shared dreams. Practical but comfortable. "There's my favorite in-laws," Sarah called from the front porch, where she was watering plants with one hand and holding her rounded belly with the other. 5 months pregnant, she glowed with the particular radiance of impending motherhood. "How's my grandchild today?" Jace asked, giving her a careful hug. "Active," she laughed. "I think he or she is going to be a soccer player, or maybe a tap dancer." Marcus emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that declared him Dad's cooking in cheerful letters, a Father's Day gift from Sarah that he wore with obvious pride. The sight of his son confidently preparing Sunday dinner still amazed Jace, who remembered when Marcus's culinary skills had been limited to cereal and peanut butter sandwiches. "Elmer's fan club is already assembled," Marcus said, nodding toward the backyard where 3 neighborhood children were waiting by the fence. They developed a routine for these visits. Elmer held court in the backyard, accepting worship from local children while the adults cooked and talked. The donkey seemed to understand his role as the neighborhood's exotic pet, standing patiently for photos and dispensing gentle nuzzles to anyone who approached with proper respect. During dinner, Marcus had become an excellent cook. It turned out they talked about everyday things: Sarah's pregnancy symptoms, Marcus's latest project designing a wind farm in West Texas, Jace's students at the stable. It was the kind of comfortable conversation that had once seemed impossible between father and son. "Oh, I almost forgot," Marcus said, disappearing into the garage and returning with a wrapped package. "Sarah and I saw this and thought Elmer might like it." Inside was a new halter, custom-made from soft leather with brass fittings that gleamed like gold. It was the kind of quality equipment that cost more than Jace used to spend on groceries for a month. Beautiful and functional and obviously chosen with care. It's too nice, Jace protested. But Marcus waved off his objections. He's family, Marcus said simply. And family deserves the best we can give. Later, as the sun set over Austin, they sat on the back porch watching Elmer model his new halter for the neighborhood children. The donkey seemed to know he looked magnificent, carrying himself with extra dignity as he posed for smartphone photos. "I've been thinking," Marcus said quietly, "about what you said at the wedding. About Elmer teaching you that broken things can still be useful." Jace waited, sensing something important was coming. "I think maybe that's what family is," Marcus continued. "A bunch of broken people who figure out how to be useful to each other, how to take care of each other despite all the ways we've failed." "That's about the wisest thing I've heard in a long time," Jace replied. The following Saturday, Jace found himself back at a county auction for the first time since he'd bought Elmer. Martha had sent him to look for a gentle horse for the children's program, and he'd brought Elmer along for company and moral support. The familiar sights and sounds of the sale barn brought back a flood of memories. But they were good memories now. He watched the livestock parade through the ring with the eye of someone who knew quality and value, making careful notes about potential purchases. Near the end of the sale, they brought out a tired-looking pony, a little paint mare with kind eyes and a coat that had seen better days. The auctioneer's enthusiasm was perfunctory. Ponies were common, and this one was clearly past her prime. "What am I bid for this gentle children's pony?" the auctioneer called. "She's broke to ride and drive, good with kids, just needs someone to appreciate her." The bidding was slow and half-hearted. Jace watched a young father in the front row, holding the hand of a girl about 8 years old, who was clearly smitten with the little mare. The man kept looking at his daughter's hopeful face, then at his wallet, clearly wrestling with a decision he couldn't afford. When the bidding stalled at $40, Jace saw his opportunity. He caught the auctioneer's eye and nodded. $50 from the gentleman with the donkey, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 60? No one else bid." The pony was sold to Jace for $50, and he watched the little girl's face crumple with disappointment, while her father tried to comfort her. After completing the paperwork, Jace approached the father and daughter. "Excuse me," he said to the man. "I couldn't help but notice your daughter liked that pony." "She did," the father replied carefully. "But we just can't afford a horse right now. Maybe someday." "Well," Jace said, kneeling down to the girl's level, "it so happens I buy horses for a riding stable, and I think this little mare might be perfect for our children's program. Would you like to come visit her sometime? Maybe take some riding lessons?" The girl's face lit up like sunrise, and her father's expression shifted from wariness to gratitude as Jace explained about Sunset Stables and their scholarship program for families who couldn't afford regular lessons, driving home with Elmer in the trailer and the little paint mare beside him. Jace reflected on how much had changed since that day when he'd spent his last $23 on an unwanted donkey. He'd gained a home, a job, a renewed relationship with his son, and the promise of becoming a grandfather. But most importantly, he'd learned that sometimes the most broken hearts really do recognize each other across a crowded room. And when they do, when they choose connection over pride and love over fear, they can heal together in ways that make them both stronger than they ever were alone. Elmer, resplendent in his new halter, stood calmly in the trailer as they headed toward home, ears forward and alert to whatever adventures tomorrow might bring.